Hello everyone, my name is Eric. I'm a limited licensed master social worker and psychotherapist. I've been working with children, youth, and adults for 10 years. On this week's episode of So You Want to Learn Psychology, we're going to be following up on last week's episode on Carl Rogers' work on becoming a person. Last week, we focused on the essential concepts of person-centered psychotherapy and Carl Rogers' contributions to the field as a whole. This week, we're going to focus on a very important chapter in this book, one that I think provides a lot of insight for practicing psychotherapists and students who are learning about the models and theories of psychotherapy. Like I said in last week's video, I'd be surprised if many people in school to become social workers, psychologists, or counselors even know about Rogers' 7 stages of change in psychotherapy. It's not something that I've ever heard talked about on a conceptual or theoretical level before. It was never mentioned to me in college, and I never heard about it mentioned in any of the other books on psychology that I've ever read. And I'm truly surprised because it feels like it gives the reader the most accurate picture of what actual change looks like inside of the psychotherapy office. I don't know if human nature or something as conceptually ambiguous as change can be defined or quantified by any theory, no matter how deeply descriptive our words or definitions may be. With that being said, Carl Rogers believed that change was a process, something most people intuitively understand, but Rogers sought to capture this process and describe it in a way that makes it easy to see when changes are happening in psychotherapy. This isn't as much for the client as much as it exists to help the therapist identify changes in the client's disposition, but as clients become more involved and engaged in the psychotherapeutic process, ultimately their changes will register internally, and a good, observant therapist will also be able to notice them. In the first stage of change, according to Rogers, there is an unwillingness to communicate self. Communication is only about externals. Feelings and personal meanings are neither recognized nor owned. Personal constructs are extremely rigid. Close and communicative relationships are construed as dangerous. No problems are recognized or perceived at this stage. There is no desire to change. This beginning stage is most evident in court or family-ordered psychotherapy. Anything that could be considered involuntary is likely to begin here. People who have been ordered to counseling or psychotherapy services don't think they have any problems. It's everyone else who has the problems. This attitude is blatantly evident if you've ever encountered someone addicted to alcohol or other drugs. With that being said, a non-judgmental attitude and the willingness to communicate the facts of the situation are often what's necessary to move from this stage to the next. If I was working with a person ordered to psychotherapy because they showed up drunk to work, I may say something like this. Look, man, I'm not here to judge you. I've had problems with alcohol myself in the past. Where we have a problem is that you went to work drunk and you got caught, and now you're here. That's the problem. If we can figure that out together, you might be able to keep your job and maybe even be able to leave here a little sooner than you expected. You'll notice that I didn't say anything like, if we can figure this out together, you may be able to keep your job and maybe even kick your drinking habit too. This would be an obvious overreach of professional ethics and client-centered psychotherapy. Nothing indicates that this person was ready to change or even wants to quit drinking alcohol. It's not up to me to decide what his goals are, and even though virtually everyone knows and understands the dangers of excessive drinking, I have no right to impose my values on another person. In the second stage of change, which most private practice clinicians and clients begin in because there is a desire for treatment which relies upon the recognition of certain problems pertaining to the client's life, the client begins by talking about things other than themselves. Rogers writes, expression begins to flow in regards to non-self topics. Problems are perceived as external to self. There is no sense of personal responsibility in problems. Feelings are described as unknown or sometimes as past objects. Feelings may be exhibited, but they're not recognized as such or owned. Experiencing is bound by the structure of the past. Differentiation of personal meanings and feelings is very limited and global, and contradictions may be expressed, but with little recognition as contradictions. Nearly all people who are new to psychotherapy, or those who just take a while to warm up, start off their sessions by talking about events of the past week. A lot of times this is an opportunity for the client to gauge the levels of the therapist's emotional connectivity. They are feeling out to see if their therapist is engaged. Does he look tired? Does he appear anxious? Is he relaxed and ready to receive the emotional weight that I'm ready to bring down on him? Not very many people just walk into the room and get straight down to business. Most people engage in some degree of small talk and trivial matters that don't necessarily pertain to their deeper parts of their emotional experience. This is normal, healthy, and expected. Stage 3 involves a freer flowing expression about the self as an object, expressions about self-related experiences as objects. There is also expression about the self as a reflected object existing primarily in others. There is much expression or descriptions of feelings and personal meanings not now present. There is very little acceptance of feelings. For the most part, feelings are revealed as something shameful, bad, or abnormal, or unacceptable in other ways. Feelings are exhibited and are sometimes recognized as feelings. Experiencing is described as in the past or as somewhat remote to the self. This definition is confusing to the reader who doesn't understand what Rogers means by self and others as objects. What he means is that most people tend to define themselves and others by what they do or what they provide. An example is, I am a psychotherapist and skateboarder. My sister works in the medical field and she is the mother of my 2 nephews. In this description of myself and my family, I have not described my true self, nor have I described my sister as a self of her own. I use nouns to describe myself, and within those nouns are meanings. Psychotherapist and skateboarder are objects. They don't actually define or describe me in any meaningful way. Anyone could be either of those things. They're not unique to me. The same thing goes for the description of my sister and nephews. It's a subtle differentiation, but as psychotherapists, we are always listening attentively for the ways our clients talk about themselves. Feelings are generally recognizable to the clients in this stage, but they are mostly referred to as past feelings, as in, I remember when that happened to me, I felt terrible. They cannot access the feeling now because they have filed it away as a past experience. They felt terrible, but they do not feel terrible, because feeling comes later. I would describe these first 3 stages as the beginning of treatment in psychotherapy. Once people feel comfortable talking and feel heard and respected, they generally don't have any issues talking about surface level details of their past experience and how they felt about them. It's very easy to get comfortable here and not feel the need to rock the boat because your client is giving you what you think you want. They talk about themselves and their past, and you listen with an empathetic ear. However, it isn't long before this becomes incredibly stale for both people involved. If you and your clients get stuck in this stage, they'll start making it known to you by being late for sessions, canceling, or coming in with nothing to talk about. If you begin sessions with a review of the past week and you're feeling like you're both struggling to go beyond that, then that's because we haven't gotten to stage 4. Stage 4 consists of the client being able to describe more intense feelings of the not now present variety. Feelings are described as objects in the present. Occasionally, feelings are expressed as sometimes in the present, sometimes breaking through and almost against the client's wishes. There is a tendency towards experiencing feeling in the immediate present, and there is a distrust and fear of this possibility. There is little open acceptance of feelings, though some acceptance is exhibited. Experiencing is less bound by the structure of the past and may occasionally occur with little postponement. There is a loosening of the way experience is construed, and there are sometimes discoveries of personal constructs. There is a definite recognition of these constructs, and there is a beginning of questioning their validity. This stage is marked by the person recognizing not just the feelings they experienced back then, but also the feelings they experience now as they bring up the past. They may say something like, "Holy shit, I feel terrible saying that," or something along those lines. This is also the stage where real affects become apparent in the room. Clients may cry, subtle or sobbing. They may raise their voice and become irritable or even angry. They may divulge a secret and look at you with a sincere expression of guilt or shame. All of these moments are somewhat fleeting, and the person is likely to recoil in an attempt to compose themselves immediately to try to gauge the therapist's reaction again. Is showing this amount of emotion safe, and does he understand? According to Rogers, stage 5 is marked by feelings that are expressed freely in the present, feeling and a very close to being fully experienced. They bubble up and seep through, despite the fear and distrust which the client feels at experiencing them in their fullness and immediacy. There is a beginning tendency to realize that experiencing a feeling involves a direct referent. There's a surprise and fright, rarely pleasure, at the feeling that bubbles through. There's an increasing ownership of feelings and the desire to be these, to be the real me. Experience is loosened, no longer remote, and frequently occurs with little postponement. The way in which experience is construed are much loosened, and there are fresh discoveries of personal constructs as constructs and critical examination and questioning of these. There is a strong evident tendency towards exactness and differentiation of feelings and meanings. There is an increasingly clear facing of contradictions and incongruences in experience. Lastly, there is an increasing quality of acceptance of responsibility for the problems being faced, a concern as to how he has contributed. There is an increasingly freer dialogue within the self, an improvement in the reduced blockages of internal communication. If your clients in psychotherapy make it to stage 5, they are well on their way to a complete personality change. Here, as opposed to stage 4, clients are no longer as concerned with how the therapist feels with their displays of emotion, because of the therapist's unconditional positive regard and mutually established therapeutic alliance, but are now battling and struggling within themselves for personality change and emotional authenticity and congruence. At this point, too, it should be noted that 95% of this probably takes place outside of the therapeutic hour. When you only meet a person once a week for an hour, you as a therapist have very little influence. But when a session strikes a chord with a client and they come back the next week having completely changed their minds about themselves, others, and their experiences, you can guarantee that they were battling with themselves all week. I always tell my clients that after a major gain in insight or reduction in symptoms, it is not me or this hour that caused the change, but their continued efforts to do the work outside of therapy. As we near the end of the 7 stages of development, we get to the final stages, which indicate a significant growth in terms of the emotional acceptance and experiencing themselves, no longer as objects but as living beings experiencing in the moment. According to Rogers, stage 6 consists of a feeling which has been previously stuck, has been inhibited in its process quality, is experienced with immediacy now. The feeling flows to its full result. A present feeling is directly experienced with immediacy and richness. The immediacy of the experience and the feeling which constitutes its content are accepted. This is something which, not something to be denied, feared, or struggled against. There's a quality of living subjectively in the experience, not feeling about it, and the self as an object tends to disappear. This stage is accompanied by a physiological loosening, and the experience are more congruent as the person gains awareness. Relevant personal constructs are dissolved. In this stage, there are no longer problems, external or internal. The client is living, subjectively, a phase of his problem. It is not an object. Clients in this stage are now deep in their own emotions. They willingly express and live through their emotions despite what they once might have felt as shameful, embarrassing, hurtful, or ridiculous. There's almost a total disregard for how the therapist perceives their behavior. I would describe this person as being fully themselves. Before we move on to the 7th and final stage, I want to make an important admission. I don't think I've ever worked with someone long enough to see them reach stage 6. And most clients in psychotherapy terminate services long before they reach stages 6 or stage 7. It's not an indication of failure by any means. Typically, I'd say that most adults, due to the strength of their defenses and their neurotic personality patterns, will only ever get to stage 5 in therapy. They're generally too concerned with how they would be perceived socially by their therapists if they legitimately broke down in front of them for multiple weeks in a row. That's not to say that this isn't necessary for a lot of adults, but in my 10 years of experience, it's a very small percentage of people who actually get this close to experiencing themselves in this way, regardless of whether it's in the presence of a therapist or not. The final stage, the 7th stage, Rogers describes as New feelings are experienced as immediacy, richness, and detail in the therapeutic relationship and outside. The experiencing of such emotions is clear, referent. There is a growing acceptance and ownership of these feelings, a basic trust in his own process. Experiencing has almost completely lost its structure bound aspects and becomes a process experiencing. That is, the situation is experienced not as the past, but in its newness. The self becomes increasingly subjective and reflexive in its awareness of experiencing. The self is less frequently an object and is instead felt confidently as a process. Internal constructs are reformulated and reevaluated, but held loosely, which is psychological flexibility. And internal communication is clear, with feelings and symbols well matched, and fresh new terms of feelings. There is experiencing of effective choice in new ways of being. At this point in the process, the person no longer needs psychotherapy. The person and their therapist will have done all the work necessary in order for the person to live their own life and make their own decisions for how they want to be in the world. As a clinician, you might really enjoy your clients who have come so far in the process by their own hard work, but it's time to let them go. Holding on any longer is likely to result in the client becoming dependent and regressing. That's not to say that you can't keep in contact or do follow-up appointments. That would certainly be a good idea, but continuing weekly psychotherapy at this point would be unethical and hinder the continued personal growth and development of the person. That concludes this week's episode of So You Want to Learn Psychology? I hope you enjoyed. I love teaching, and doing these kind of videos is fun for me, but I can understand that the content might not be what everyone else is looking for. I will likely do a couple different kinds of videos every other week, and we're going to keep switching it up and keep things interesting. If you weren't so interested by the last two videos, I think you'll enjoy next week's. It'll be a first for the channel. Thanks again for your support. Until next time.